Welcome to the fourth Vijay Vyas Memorial Oration. We are very happy that Mr. Vijay Jagannathan has kindly consented to deliver the oration. We at Center for Microfinance are very proud to be associated with Professor V.S. Vyas. He was one of our promoters. He was one who wrote the approach document, and unfortunately, we lost him a few years ago. And to honor his contribution and his memory, we've had an annual lecture in his oration in his memory on his birthday. And we have been having this continuously. The first year, the oration was delivered by Dr. Y.V. Reddy. After that, it was followed up by Professor Anirudh Krishna. Last year, it was delivered by Professor Tridip Surud. And this year, Professor Vijay Jagannathan is delivering the lecture. Vijay Jagannathan is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, Washington, D.C. He started his career as a civil servant, as an IAS officer. After 10 years with the civil service, he moved on. He worked with the World Bank for 24 years, has worked on water, environmental issues, agricultural development, urban development, and various other aspects. Professor Jagannathan was a good friend of Professor Vyas, and today he will talk on a topic which was very close to Professor Vyas's heart, which is about small farmers. He's going to deliver a talk on climate change in small farmer, how improved management of methane emission can finance local departments. We are also very privileged and happy to have Rajiv Vyas, Professor Vyas's son. Thanks a lot, Rajiv, for joining us. And he will speak a few words about Professor Vyas as well as Vijay, and then we'll carry this forward. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Rajiv.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Srinath. Thank you, Malika and the CmF family. I would like to thank everybody from my family, that is my mother, Vikram, Janki, Maru, everybody, for honoring the memory of my father. This is something that has been, the lecture series has been something which has been very close to his heart. And this is something that he also started in Ajit Foundation, where the idea was of dialogue between the thinker and of various persuasions and the civic society. He incorporated this as one of the founding activities of Ajit Foundation, and we are happy to see that his thought process is being carried forward in CmF as well. Ajit Foundation has had a landmark year in the sense that post-COVID, due to the initiatives taken mainly by Dr. Vikram Vyas and by Janki, and my mother, we have completely converted Ajit Foundation onto digital as well as eco-friendly. We have initiated that. We have Mala Library, which has been converted from a Tonga, which is the horse carriage, to e-vehicle. We have a complete online library. We have solar power, which is powering the Ajit Foundation, and various other initiatives which are apart from the hygiene part of it, in the sense of the environmental issue, but also in terms of the inclusiveness of the society. We have the various initiatives that have taken place, starting with the inauguration of e-vehicle in the Harijan Basti, etc. So these are some of the things that were extremely close to his heart, and these are some of the initiatives that we are taking forward on the active direction of Dr. Vikram Vyas and Janki ji. On a personal note, I would really like to thank Dr. Vijay Jagannathan. He is a part of our family. I think we hold very, very fond memories of him and Sheila, right from the time uh, when we moved to Boston. And the first people that came in to actually welcome our family were Vijay and Sheila. And that was something that was carried on to DC as well. And we had several road trips across the eastern coast of US. I owe my first job also to the recommendation of Vijay. He was extremely kind and he reached out to a friend of his, or I believe a relative, and helped me in getting my first job in that. So, Vijay is welcome, Vijay, and I please. I'm so happy to have you and reconnect with you after all these years. On behalf of Mummy, Vikram, Janki, everybody, welcome, and of course CRF. So over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajiv sir. Thank you, Professor Shriram. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Rajiv sir. As mentioned by Professor Shriram, we've been very fortunate to have eminent speakers deliver the Professor Vyas oration so far. Last year's oration, which was the third in the series, was delivered by Professor Tridip Suhrud, who's India's finest Gandhian scholar, and he spoke on why valorize the peasantry and put the issues of agriculture and farmers, which was one of the core areas of work of Professor Vyas in context last year. We would now have a virtual release of the monograph of the oration which he delivered. So can we have the video, please? Thank you. We have Professor Tridip Suhrud with us today. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us for the release of the monograph. And I would request you to say a few words. Over to Professor Tridip Suhrud.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Mallika. Thank you, Vyas's family. This concern about peasantry and Gandhi's relationship to it has continued for me personally and intellectually. We've just released, and Shriram knows that, the first of the possible 9 volumes of the testimonies of the peasants from Champaran, along with the National Archives of India. So that's something that remains an abiding concern, and I thank you for pushing me to speak about something that I've been thinking of, feeling deeply, but that came out as something in sharp focus because of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would request Dr. Vijay Jagannathan to deliver the 4th Vyas Memorial Oration. Climate change, global warming is one of the realities which we are faced with today, and the concern has been ever increasing. Like shared by Rajiv sir, Ajit Vyas, founded by Professor Vijay Shankar Vyas, has done its own bit in going green in all its initiatives and going digital. So this is a topic which has increased, which has led to a lot of interest and a lot of concern among the people in the development fraternity, academics, and even the corporates in India. And therefore, we are fortunate that Dr. Vijay Jagannathan is with us to speak on this. So over to you, Dr. Vijay Jagannathan, to deliver the oration. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Shriram, family, friends, and admirers of Dr. Vijay Shankar Vyas. I am honored to deliver this 4th oration in his memory. My wife and I have very fond recollections of him, Lakshmi ji, and their sons. It's only fitting that his sons, Dr. Vikram Vyas and Rajiv Vyas, are carrying forward the sharing of views and ideas on the various topics that were so dear to Dr. Vyas's heart. Dr. Vyas was more than a leading agricultural economist in the developing world. He was a committed social activist who deeply cared about lifting India's rural poor to share the prosperity generated by economic growth and development in the country. Through his various engagements as a policymaker, scholar, administrator, and activist, his imprints are manifold, ranging from impacts in the villages of Gujarat and Rajasthan to those in various national and global fora, through views and suggestions heard with respectful attention and acted upon. Now, let me start by talking about patronage and platforms. An area of common interest I shared with him was exploring the institutional ecosystem in which small farmers and other rural poor, who constitute about 85% of the Indian farming community, survive, struggle, and sometimes flourish. The hypothesis we shared, that was relatively new 4 decades ago, but now widely accepted in the development community, was that the poor do not survive in a low-income vacuum, but instead thrive through systemic social connections that provide a large measure of self-worth to these individuals, while also reducing the emotional and economic burdens of harsh poverty and deprivation. 3 types of institutional pathways mitigate production, consumption, and marketing risks through various informal, multilateral, and bilateral connections these persons invest in with other individuals and groups. The first pathway, that has been variously described as different types of patron-client relationships, help small farmers and just 1 minute. Sorry, there was a slight. The first pathway that has been variously described as different types of patron-client relationships help small farmers and marginal farmers manage seasonal risks brought about in situations where the family either lacks purchasing power to buy food and basic necessities, or safeguards against social risks of exclusion by raising money to fulfill socially important but financially unaffordable family events such as weddings, births, deaths, spending during important festivals, etc. The resultant interlocked and usually inequitable arrangements are with well-to-do known persons in the community, typically exemplified by moneylenders, rich farmers, and food grain traders. A second pathway emerges when the rural poor engage in markets for goods and services, with entrepreneurial actions opening up new income streams. Examples include incomes from cattle and other farm animal rearing through off-farm services offered as a skilled or unskilled labor. A person's ability to generate such incremental incomes depends on his or her tolerance to take more risks. These are mediated through informal or formalized institutional platforms that pass on received wisdom from one generation to the next, to skills acquired through education and training, which could be from institutional extension services to knowledge gathered from various media sources and even from peers. The third pathway consists of active political engagements with others in the village or the larger geographic community to sustain a continuous flow of fertilizer, water, and energy subsidies, and from other grants from the central and state governments. These engagements could take the character of a patron-client relationship with local leaders, often also resulting in inequitable sharing of any government-sponsored benefits delivered. When I started my career as a subdivisional officer in the IAS in the mid-70s, an important responsibility I had was to monitor how far public resources were reaching the intended beneficiaries instead of being siphoned off by their patrons, by the village elite, and by local politicians. However, in the past decade, the penetration of digital infrastructure has greatly improved the targeting of grants and subsidies to the intended poor families, eliminating some of the worst examples of political malfeasance associated with this third pathway. Rural governance, therefore, has benefited from the spread of digital technologies that have connected millions of low-income families with vast catchments of virtual knowledge. Small and marginal farmers could potentially monetize benefits from agricultural e-extension, financial technology or fintech, precision agriculture, e-commerce, and by the inputs provided through big data collected and analyzed by artificial intelligence, drones, and satellite imaging. These could be in the form of improved farm productivity or the creation of new income-earning opportunities. While these advances have undoubtedly improved access to relevant knowledge and skills, often through open access digital platforms, they haven't lit the spark of entrepreneurship among the millions of youths entering adulthood with smaller and smaller parcels of land to cultivate. The reasons for this gap between the potentials and actuals have been discussed ad infinitum. My interpretation is the following. On the demand side, the targeted beneficiaries do not have the capacity or the confidence in many cases to make the leap to start and sustain secondary off-farm incomes. And on the supply side, potential public sector and private knowledge and solutions providers outside NGOs and civil society organizations often do not face the right incentives to inspire and sustain an ecosystem of active engagement that requires years of trust building with potential beneficiaries. A telling indicator, despite the opening up of rural India through digital channels that have the potential to rationalize the value chain from the farm gate to the end consumer, the central government's target of doubling rural incomes by 2022 remains far from being accomplished. An equally significant indicator is the failure of farmer producer organizations to achieve their stated objectives, because these institutions are yet to offer services as a multi-sectoral knowledge exchange plus a reskilling and upskilling platform that inspire confidence among farming communities. So this takes me to the next topic I'd like to cover here, the role of platforms as institutions of capacity creation. When Dr. Vyas and I first interacted about 40 years ago, the most exciting development was early successes of what I have described earlier, the second pathway of market-driven income generation. The white revolution through Operation Flood was based on the innovative policies of the Anand dairy farming model. The evidence since then has been impressive. India today has become the largest producer of milk in the world. And the Doodhwala, who was watched by hawk-eyed urban consumers because of a penchant for diluting the daily supply of milk with water, has become a distant memory. Instead, today's labeled plastic milk sachets are visible reminders of how intricate value chains empower and benefit everyone, from the individual owning a single cow to an army of logistics providers, leading to quality-conscious final consumers. While this is an example of a massive government-led success, there are many equally impressive value chains from which the rural poor have benefited, and to which many of you in this audience have contributed to in India. Through Seva, Velugu in Andhra Pradesh, Padma Shri movement in Kerala, the Ajit Foundation, as well as of self-help group federations in different parts of the country. There are similar examples among other Asian countries such as BRAC, Bangladesh Grameen Bank, and several other initiatives in Indonesia, Thailand, and Philippines that I'm aware of. These successes were anchored on sustained interactions between extension workers, microcredit institutions, knowledge providers, with the beneficiaries that led to a transfer of skills, mitigated marketing and credit risks. Most importantly, they served as platforms that built trust between small and marginal producers and subject matter experts, leading to participants enhancing productivity from their various material assets and talents to generate supplemental sources of income. And these usually outpace the incomes generated from traditional farming livelihoods. 40 years later, the governance landscape facing rural India has changed quite dramatically. The fiscal resources available with the state are significantly larger, and thereby providing much greater menu of options for policymakers. Substantial public resources have been invested in improving physical connectivity and in universalizing infrastructure and social services. Overall, however, the ability of all state governments to channel various freebies to the rural poor has been much more effective than ensuring equitable access to universal basic education and skills development. Typically, a young person from a small or marginal farm household faces greater challenges if he or she wishes to invest in skill sets necessary to set up a micro enterprise, be it to repair pump sets, farm machinery, two-wheelers, or as a service provider to monetize potential value chains in the local economies. Examples of the latter are exploding market demand from affluent rural households for a variety of consumption needs such as housing upgrades, catering, dressmaking, modern furniture, improved plumbing, and so on. Perhaps the only alternative for such persons is to adopt the third pathway described above, to seek more subsidies and grants through the political process. These public sector driven benefits are many. The Ritu Bandhu income support payout and purchase of output by the government at minimum support prices, a bewildering set of acronyms that share the stage as freebies targeting the rural poor. A perpetual election cycle between the national, state, and local hustings gives a high degree of predictability on how these entitlements will get enlarged. So what are the consequences for small and marginal farmer behavior? Adopt the second pathway by investing in economic value chains, or enthusiastically participate in the third pathway by lobbying for more freebies? The answer depends on where the farmer is living. In the more advanced states, small and marginal farmer families who have invested in education and skills building could enjoy the best of both worlds. In most of the less developed states, low-income households would most likely opt for the latter, which can be described as investing in policy alleviation through rent-seeking behavior. So let me just go through what is meant by rent-seeking behavior. The Investopedia definition is, rent-seeking is an economic concept that occurs when an entity seeks to gain added wealth without any reciprocal contribution or productivity. Typically, it revolves around government-funded social services and social service programs. In fact, in his Tarlok Singh Memorial Lecture, Dr. Vyas had elaborated on this theme by observing that although many people have escaped poverty through the various government anti-poverty programs, they remain in a twilight zone of hovering just above near poverty because of the chronic dependence on various forms of government subsidies. Rent-seeking behaviors occur in all states, but are particularly insidious in communities where the state has been unable to provide opportunities for self-development through human capital formation. My submission is that the development of rural platforms that incentivize small and marginal farmers to seek out pathways for income generation outside farming have been greatly weakened by rent-seeking behaviors, particularly in states where millions of these persons are less and less able to feed themselves, while being unable also to connect with economic opportunities of emerging local, regional, and global value chains. I quote from Dr. Vyas's Tarlok Singh Memorial Lecture, the basic units in these structures are small homogeneous groups of farmers. There's a dedicated agency to initiate and support them for a length of time. There are distinct gains in productivity and on realization of higher value for their products. There is sufficient stress and capacity building. We would like to emphasize that in present circumstances, homogeneous groups of agricultural producers with joint efforts to cater multiple needs of farming can provide effective foundation for an efficient and equitable agrarian structure. What is missing? Why are these kids not able to climb as high as their individual capacities allow? Well, first, they lack role models who show them what's possible. They lack motivation and guidance, and the kind of information our kids get, you can do it, as we say. So what if you're an illiterate farmer's daughter? You're smart, you can do it. End of quote. So that takes me to the next subtopic, which is about the new age of looming externalities. Adding to the above conclusion, that many small and marginal farmers are unable to adopt pathways to earn livelihoods outside their traditional pursuits, the new elephant in the room is the uncertainties caused by local and global externalities. At the local level, the Green Revolution came with a cost. While the package of subsidized fertilizer, water, and energy inputs enhanced farm incomes, the environmental costs of the rural commons have been significant, notably through unsustainable usage of water resources and non-point pollution of water bodies. If groundwater is used beyond its recharge rate, the water table starts to fall, and soon many more farmers sink deeper boreholes to extract the water considered necessary to meet their irrigation needs. And this leads to a further drawdown of the aquifer. Over time, the groundwater table declines in the water basin, and this has been observed over a vast swath of the Indo-Gangetic plains in satellite images tracked over the past 3 decades. Pollution of aquifers and water bodies through excessive applications of subsidized chemical fertilizers is also reported from all over India. Now imagine a situation where the monsoon rains fail to arrive. The aquifers do not get recharged at all. The groundwater table sinks even further, and millions are unable to irrigate their wheat and paddy fields. This situation is already happening in some water-stressed parts of the world. In Yemen, for example, farmers today routinely drill over 1,000 meters to extract dwindling groundwater for irrigating their farms. The solution requires collaborative actions between the government as a regulator and farming communities as the users of water, intermediate through the knowledge readily available through the digital ecosystem to understand and manage water resources in a sustainable way. The solutions may involve changing cropping patterns, adopting water accounting practices that ensure real water savings, while using community institutions to build group enforcement of sustainable water usage practices in the basin or sub-basin. Now, turning to the global level, the climate threats are even more alarming. Recent global climate and weather events are disrupting conventional farm practices throughout the world. Who would, for example, have imagined droughts in the perpetually rainy England or forest fires in France's wine-growing areas? IPCC projections indicate that no country will escape the consequences of climate change. As far as India is concerned, in the decades ahead, there will be severe disruptions in seasonal monsoon rains on which all our farmers are greatly dependent. A year when the monsoon fails to reach the subcontinent is no longer science fiction, but a distinct possibility. These emerging local and global environmental risks are on a scale and scope that cannot be compensated by pursuing rent-seeking entitlements through the political process. Required is a fundamental rethinking of how small and marginal farmers can empower themselves to be less vulnerable to catastrophic impacts of climate through whatever opportunities are now getting available. So the next topic I'd like to touch upon is that are there any possibilities of converting climate change concerns to a business opportunity for small and marginal farmers? Since the signing of the Paris Climate Accord in 2015 by all countries of the world, there has been a tremendous growth in awareness that climate change is for real, and that unless corrective actions are taken, global warming could irreversibly change living and working conditions everywhere. The stated climate goal of the Accord is to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels, although the best case estimates today are probably even reaching 2.5 degrees would be an ambitious target. Now, all countries are committed toward achieving the global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, so that a climate neutral world is achieved by mid-century. There's also the realization that abating greenhouse gases comes at huge costs because most of our energy sources are still derived from fossil fuels, and switching over to renewable energy or alternative fuels such as hydrogen or solar energy require finding trillions of dollars of additional funding. The search is on to investigate options for financing these massive incremental costs and sequencing in intervention so that activities with cheaper or even negative marginal abatement costs are completed before tackling the more complex retrofitting challenges in the mining and industrial sectors. So securing the biggest bang for the buck through climate finance is center stage in climate policy dialogues. In terms of project and policy design, the Green Climate Fund offers financing of project-level technical assistance and highly concessional investment support to validate new models for engaging communities and subnational entities in climate-friendly investments. Other multilateral and bilateral financiers are also allocating substantial resources to promote such investments. Another very interesting development are those of voluntary markets for carbon mitigation, which are growing very rapidly, and it's already estimated to be about $1 billion now because of shareholder pressure on large companies to take climate actions as a significant part of their environmental and social governance, ESG commitments. On the policy front, more and more countries have initiated policies for pricing carbon through either a carbon tax, through which the government either levies a fee on GHG emissions or establishes an emission trading system that places a limit or cap on the total volume of GHG emissions in one or more sectors of the economy. Each ETS allowance specifies a right to emit a certain volume of emissions, such as a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. If the entity is unable to meet its cap, it could offset by paying another entity abating the GHG on its behalf through a cap and trade system. So what this means is that conceptually, if there is a company in Europe or in the United States which finds that the cost of abating carbon in its own production line is higher than the cost of abating the same amount of carbon in, let's say, in a farm community in India or China, they could always think of using the cap and trade system to start working with these other entities. So these tradable emissions are distributed to firms covered by the cap and therefore generate a carbon price, which would vary depending on the extent of ETS coverage. Currently, there are 68 carbon pricing initiatives in the form of emission trading programs or emission taxes, and they cover about 23% of global GHG emissions, notable being the European ETS. But other countries have also followed suit. China has launched an ETS through which 2,100 power plants are included in a cap and trade system, and the recent carbon price is reported to be around US dollars 8.5 per metric ton of CO2. The country level carbon price depends on the extent of sectoral coverage. That varies from country to country. For example, in New Zealand, the current carbon price is around US $85 per metric tons, which gets translated to a methane price of US $630 per metric ton, because methane is much more carbon intensive than carbon dioxide. And this has led to some very interesting results reported in the New York Times just yesterday. Sheep farmers are switching land use in their ranches from sheep grazing to carbon farming by growing more trees to capture carbon from the atmosphere instead of releasing enteric methane from sheep. While India still does not have a carbon pricing policy, there are substantial opportunities to tap into voluntary markets for carbon mitigation. And more importantly, prepare for a future when methane savings will be potentially a valuable revenue source for participating communities. So you might ask, why methane? Among the various greenhouse gases, methane is identified as a GHG that should be aggressively abated first, because the short-term potency of trapping heat in the atmosphere is 25 times that of carbon dioxide. In scale, the global atmospheric concentration of methane has grown from a pre-industrial value of about 715 parts per billion to 1,782 by 2007, a nearly 150% rise and far above the natural range of the last 650,000 years. Methane is emitted from a variety of economic activities, some expensive to abate while others much less expensive to abate. For example, in capital-intensive activities such as mining of coal, petroleum, and natural gas, the process of capturing methane is a significant incremental cost to the industry and therefore challenging to implement. A second major source of methane emissions is from human settlements through organic matter generated from solid and liquid waste. The conventional good practice is for municipalities to dispose organic waste in sanitary landfills where decomposing materials continually emit methane into the atmosphere. Capturing this methane through hydrolysis or other industrial processes is also expensive. While the reuse of methane for compressed natural gas or renewable energy production could generate some revenues, there are overall net abatement costs that a typical municipality can hardly afford to finance without concessional money. The third area, which is much more promising source of methane abatement, is in rural areas, because a systematic program of methane reduction could provide significant co-benefits to households through sustainable water usage, through increased crop yields, improved animal husbandry, and better quality of life for all the residents. For example, about 147 million tons of agricultural methane, or equivalent of 4 billion tons of CO2 is emitted every year. Of this, rice accounts for 20%, and enteric methane from farm animals account for 68%. Of the rice, the major emitters of methane are the large paddy growing countries of the world, which are China, India, and Indonesia. Between the three of them itself, they generate a lot of the methane from rice. Now, in the case of rice, the recommended change is from flooding paddy fields to systematic wetting and drying of the growing crop, while non-flooded plastic film mulching can keep water saturated at the root level while reducing methane emissions. These changes deliver co-benefits to farmers by reducing water usage while increasing rice yields. In the case of farm animals, helping farmers through improved quality of feed reduces enteric emissions of methane. A third area is improved manure and septage management through dry farm compost and acidifying manure at the start of summer. There is this global methane initiative, which is a global knowledge platform, and that estimates that achieving a 50% reduction in methane emissions by 2050 compared to a business as usual scenario, and maintaining those reductions till the end of the century could help reduce global temperature on the same scale as reductions in CO2 emissions, that is about 0.55 degrees Celsius. Global climate policy interests is therefore increasingly focused on the farm sector as a cost-effective way to reduce methane generation, while also generating substantial economic co-benefits to local communities. Methane abatement costs could actually be negative in the sense that participating communities could economically benefit while the global commons rids itself of an important GHG contributor. Now, there have been some pilot studies to see how effective these are. One comprehensive study of alternate wetting and drying of rice paddies in the Philippines, which as we saw earlier, is a way of reducing methane generation, undertaken by the International Rice Research Institute, Los Baños, documented the several valid reasons why and when farmers are willing to switch from traditional method of flooding paddy rice. As we are all aware, in the Philippines, as in India, mostly there are small farmers. So the dialogue has to be done with many farmers if there's to be any change in the way they carry on with agricultural practices. The research concluded that farm communities were willing to make a switch when they were convinced that the economic co-benefits were substantial enough to warrant a switch from conventional paddy practices. Farmers who relied on pumped groundwater to flood their fields appeared most willing to adopt alternate wetting and drying techniques because they benefited through the saved energy costs from pumping apart from increased rice yield. By contrast, farmers who utilized monsoonal rains to flood the fields were less willing to adopt alternate wetting and drying practices because they had a different set of concerns about the additional costs of repeated draining of the fields and also the necessity to dedicate much more time de-weeding when the fields were periodically drained. As far as India is concerned, a recent study by T. Parthasarthi in Coimbatore concluded that there was a substantial decline in methane emissions when farmers switched from conventional flood irrigation of paddy to drip irrigation. The water savings reported was 23.3%, with seasonal methane emission flux declining by 78%, and an overall impact of rice productivity gain of 29%. Now, an important caveat is that a decision to participate is not enough for one individual farmer to make, because to have a methane reduction, you do need to have a sufficiently large geographic area. And this is where this whole issue of the community acceptance comes in. And as we saw in the case of the Philippines too, some communities are willing to accept for good economic reasons, while others are not, because they feel that it's not worth the trouble of making change. But the key point is it cannot be mandated by executive fiat. However, if the appropriate community group signals its acceptance, the net benefits of focusing on methane management actually goes beyond just rice cultivation and water savings. It can help rural communities secure the knowledge and monetize several routine activities that involves organic material management. Enhanced efficiency in the application of chemical fertilizers, because another greenhouse gas, one of the causes of greenhouse gas is the N2O, which is released from chemical fertilizers, and that can also be curtailed. Aerobic cultivation and dry dynamic seeding could result as the community learns how to maximize the carbon farming revenues, as illustrated by the ongoing changes by the New Zealand sheep farmers. A key requirement in a situation where there are hundreds of small and marginal farmers is a farmer group's acceptance of the proposed business model and willingness to remain collectively engaged over several years. The size of the group cannot be mandated by government regulation. It would have to be determined on a case-by-case basis through pilot projects. So the model still needs to be validated through several pilots, but the basic principles are that the community has to have a strong sense of strong willingness to participate in this program. Driving this process is technological developments that enable accurate measurement of methane using remote sensing from satellite and drones. By early next year, there will be an open access database on methane characteristics for every pixel of remote sensing images. Once a farming community has defined the geographic coverage of a methane abatement proposal, a combination of satellite and airborne surveillance through drones can accurately estimate the baseline methane generation and track how far reductions in methane emissions are being achieved digitally. This information can form the basis of payouts to communities from voluntary or national markets. So that brings me to the next point, which is that how do we develop a method of testing business methane abatement models for small and marginal farmers? A key aspect is that the digital ecosystem linking the beneficiaries with global players is data-driven, implying that if contractual terms are not met, the fund flow will stop. The transactions costs of dealing with many small and marginal farmers need to be manageable. A prerequisite, therefore, is that there should be sufficient homogeneity in the community to own the contract and enforce agreements among its members to be attractive for interest from the knowledge provider community. This is a necessary condition for sustaining methane reductions by many small and marginal farmers through a value chain virtually connecting the accountable group to global climate knowledge providers, investors, and financiers. So the idea is still very much a new one and requires field testing and validation. The next step would be then to prepare a project concept document that identifies the key elements of a methane reduction action plan. These include, first, compile a methane inventory database for the pilot area based on publicly available data, including available information from global platforms such as the Global Dairy Platform and the Global Methane Initiative, which have a lot of information from different parts of the world. A lot of it also collected through satellite images and ground truthing. Then the second is to utilize available ground truth and remote sensing data to estimate the relative contributions to methane generation from rice paddies, livestock enteric sources, and manure. And third, household organic and human waste disposal volumes. These could provide inputs for developing a project concept that indicates a time-bound program of reductions in overall methane emissions in the spatial area that is under the community oversight. The third step is to combine data analysis with learning from examples of good government regulatory practices. For example, there is a very effective rural methane abatement program, which is implemented by the California Air Resources Board. And this kind of experience from other countries will provide insights to state and central government policymakers for formulating an appropriate regulatory framework. A third step then is to draft a methane action plan, which identifies the methane mitigation activities and a time-bound implementation program, which will be remotely monitored by satellite and airborne surveillance on the requisite scale. Based on this document, the financier conducts an appraisal. If there's agreement, the community will receive payments on a regular basis for contracted reductions in methane emissions within the geographically defined area. These revenues can fund a virtual platform for managing the methane program that is accessible to all stakeholders. As the revenues will be substantial, they could also be utilized for improving local infrastructure, reskilling and upskilling youth, and expanding local off-farm income earning opportunities. So that takes me to the end of my oration, and my concluding remark is really making a pitch. Accessing significant sources of climate finance could be a way of galvanizing marginal and small farmer communities to move away from rent-seeking activities to adopting pathways promoting sustainable development at the local and global levels. Communities with demonstrated evidence of group solidarity could monetize their existing institutional strengths to raise substantial resources from methane abatement activities to finance local development. This is an idea I wanted to leave behind with you, and I'm sure Dr. Vyas would have been intrigued to hear if he was here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. That was a very insightful talk. There are lots of questions that are coming in. I hope we'll be able to take as many as possible. I'll start with the first question, which Dr. Chitore Guha Sarkar, from Head of Agriculture from the Tata Trust, has asked. This is basically saying, this is completely about the small farmers. And he's asking, is the per capita emission any significantly different from those of other countries where livestock intensive farming, especially cattle meat, is happening? That's one question. And a supplementary, which I'd like to sort of add from his side, I would also like to know how carbon finance of our Indian small farmers can, how can they benefit in carbon finance, particularly if there is some scope. These are the two questions to start with.
Thank you, Dr. Sriram. As I qualified my remarks, I think we do need a lot of data before we can really come to some very firm conclusions on what are the potentials, because this is still relatively a new area. But what the evidence is showing us is that there are some, particularly in areas where there's flooding of rice fields for paddy, the methane emissions are substantial because of the nature of the flooding, because that generates a lot of methane. The amount of methane is also very well known and monitored through satellites. And so if you supplement it with drones and ground truthing, we can get a relatively good estimate on the potentials on the rice side. On the side of animals, what we have is really much more of what's available in the Western world. And what they have found is that the enteric emissions is a huge issue. And in India, of course, right from Mahatma Gandhi's time, everyone had been talking about the value of, manure. The gobar gas plants unfortunately failed. But today, actually, there are huge opportunities of also collecting not only the cattle and other dung, but also the human waste and so on, and then using them to capture the methane. So there are these possibilities. But one of the challenges we face is that these are still, as far as India is concerned, they're mainly conceptual. We have to validate it with actual numbers. And the reason why I mentioned rice paddy is that's one where we do have a reasonably good idea that it's going to be substantial. And particularly the co-benefits are going to be substantial in the parts of India where groundwater irrigation is used for, for rice cultivation. Because that's where you have this double whammy problem. That is, you're depleting the aquifer and also creating a lot of methane because of rice production. So I don't think I've given a complete answer to the first question, but what the key point is that there are really two key points. One is we do know a priori, we know that rice paddy is probably the best area to start working on it. Many of our poorest regions in India also are heavily into flooded rice paddy fields. So that could be a very good candidate to get much more funding and also for getting some real money into the hands of the farmers. And the second point, which I hope came across in my presentation, is that it has to be through some collective action. Now, in New Zealand, for example, the ranches are huge in size. So an individual rancher can just say that I'm going to convert my 1,000 acres from sheep to trees. But that's not the case in India. One farmer says he'll go to alternate wetting and drying. It's not going to make any difference unless all the other contiguous farms agree. And the size, what would be the appropriate size, is something which we need to investigate because by looking at the numbers and then figuring out what would be most appropriate. The same thing is being, China is facing exactly the same problems, and they are also in the process of testing out the pilots at this stage. But we don't have firm answers to those questions.
Thanks a lot. I mean, thank you very much. The other questions are also coming out largely regarding the small farmers. I guess, given that we are all followers of Professor Vyas, I guess that's where we are all coming from. There's Ganesh Neelam who asked the same question, and Satish also is asking the same. Manan Chaudhary is also asking the same question as to how do we meet the aspirations of the small farmers and involve them in the climate change agenda. I mean, just now you said that an individual farmer, it is difficult and we need to get them together. Is there a way in which we can collectivize and sensitize them and convert that into a revenue model? Is there some other, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think obviously the easiest would be where you've already got a fairly active small farmer group, which have been doing several other things, maybe what I call the second pathway, if they are involved. For example, if many of the small farmers are also in the milk value chain, they would be an ideal group because they do have the sort of the necessary social structures in place already to have a dialogue and discussion. But the most important thing is for them to understand that this kind of payout is coming because there are funds available from the global commons, which can be distributed to local communities as long as they're helping solve a global issue. So methane is a worldwide problem. It's not an Indian problem or an American problem. But if you reduce methane in even 50 acres of a village somewhere, it has the same impact as reducing the methane from one of the oil fields in the Middle East or whatever, which is much more expensive. And so you have to spend a lot more money to do that. So essentially the point is that the same thing can be done at a much lower cost. The only cost we have is, I think, which is also lying at the heart of all these questions, is that getting small farmers together is also not that easy. There are high transactions costs. So it can only work if there's the amount of community awareness is improved and farmers begin to realize that if they work collectively in this, there could be a substantial flow, because remember, it's 25 times the intensity of carbon dioxide. And that's what happened in New Zealand too. The price of carbon may be $70, $80, but the farmer is getting close to $700 per ton, which is saved. So the amounts are pretty substantial. And so if you did have a very, dynamic leader at, say, a panchayat level, or even higher at maybe at a taluk level, and who's able to collect everyone together, that would be fantastic. But I don't think that's possible at the early stage, because there'll be a lot of skepticism and people won't agree. That's why I think the pilots have to be relatively modest, but with very strong social bonds. And there is funding available for that. So, the Green Climate Fund, for example, does give funds out to test out these kinds of models. So my point is that if we started doing the testing and did it in maybe, whatever is feasible, it has to be based on the volunteers who are willing to come forward, both at the state government level and in the community. Then I think we can start talking with numbers and be much more confident about when small farmers can get together and when they cannot. But what is, I think, particularly encouraging for all of us is that we do have other models, like, several NGOs have been able to mobilize these farmers based on the economic incentives. And essentially, climate finance is an economic incentive. It's not a rent-seeking kind of thing, because you deliver something to the global community and they give you back through a virtual platform. And the virtual platform can be used for so many other things, including getting all the very smart app developers, others coming in, and the huge amount of data gets generated in the village, and then that can be used for other things. So it's just a start of a process. So I'm saying that we are now probably at the stage of where we were in the Green Revolution when, Norman Borlaug discovered this whole package of inputs. And then from then, it took many years for the Green Revolution to really morph into something which led to results. We are right at that early stage, but it's a stage to start, and China has already started it. So my point is, there's no reason why India should be left behind. Because India and China are the two who will benefit the most from agricultural methane capture. They'll get the most funds flowing in.
So Vijay, since you mentioned China, Malika has a question which is related to China. She says, since you're already working with the Chinese government broadly on this, are there some initiatives and lessons that we can learn, in particular reference to smallholder farmers in India? What is it that we can sort of pick up from the Chinese early experiments?
Well, one is, the Chinese model, as I think Dr. Vyas had also in several of his speeches mentioned, they had opened up the local level value chains much before India did. And from the 1980s itself, they started opening up a lot of opportunities for local entrepreneurs to do things and earn money outside farming. So even today, the number of farmers entirely dependent on their little farm is much less than in India. So with that, what has also happened is, and because they have a much better educational system, it's much easier for people to comprehend and also to basically function in an environment where contracts have to be honored. These are business contracts. So you cannot just say that I'm not going to give you what I promised to give you last year. So that culturally, it's made a huge difference. But what they are doing is exactly this first step. They are starting now to, in different parts of the country, to figure out what are the methane potentials of rice paddy, reduction of wetting of fields. And of course, they've got a very large cattle and pig population. A huge amount of effort on that side, also in enteric emissions. And the other very interesting thing they're doing is collaborating very closely with the United States. Because in the US, California is one state which has advanced a lot in terms of methane regulation. They've set up a regulatory body. They've also created incentives for farmers to move out of crops, including rice, which have had a high methane intensity. So there's a lot to be learned from the leaders, and the Chinese are doing that. And so I think what we need to do is also start doing it rather than miss the bus, because as this is a global public good, if China has a model ready and India doesn't, they're going to grab almost all the methane budget which comes in. And, they are moving. So I think their sort of planning is for the next couple of years horizon. Right now, they're collecting the data. They're trying to figure out how they'll set up a regulatory framework based on basically Californian practices and so on. But that would lead to the next step where they'll actually be having action plans and making offers. And also the other thing in both China and India is that because most of the multinationals have major operations in these countries, the voluntary carbon market is actually a significant one in India, China, and Indonesia, because for them also, it's politically as well as business-wise very smart to do something like methane capture and claim that they've done something for the global commons if, they gave a couple of $1 billion into this kind of activity. So that's where things stand now. So it's still at a very early stage. The idea over here was to seed you with some preliminary ideas.
There's an interesting question from Bharat Vijay, which is basically asking, is there an agency, who monitors the methane emission at the local level? Is there a local agency, global agency? How do we monitor these methane emissions and where they are coming from? And how does that one get a feedback loop on what's happening?
That's a very good question. And I think that lies at the heart of these new opportunities coming in. Methane gets very easily monitored remotely by satellite. So satellites flying over the world have been monitoring carbon dioxide and methane for about 30 years. What was not available until recently was that it wasn't possible to get data down to, the disaggregated level we want. So let's say only 100 acres of land, community around 100 acres wants to follow a methane action plan. Until today also, it's very hard to get that kind of data. So what is currently going on, where the World Bank is taking the lead, is to make these data sets open access resources by early next year. So which means that anyone who's got the technical knowledge of how to get into the data set can get the data for any part of the world. Because the data is there, it's just that we don't know how to access it that easily. Once it becomes open access data, the information is available. Now, once the information is available, and then you're able to create a baseline data on what is the methane emission in this particular pilot area, which would have these components, which would have rice paddy, which would have animals, and it could also have N2O coming out from chemical fertilizer and so on. Then the way it's monitored is digitally. So there would be a digital platform set up, which would be financed by one of the multilateral agencies which should do it, or Government of India could also do it. It's not that expensive to set up the platform, but the data will come automatically into the platform. And that is what gives confidence to a market player in, say, Zurich or in New York, that there is going to be an effective reduction in methane generation. Because the data platform is open access, anyone can access it. They know where the information is coming from. And year by year, you see what is the pattern by which the methane reduction took place. There would also be experts hired by, these are also details which have to be worked out, who will be advising and also providing the kind of quality control to make sure that the data platform is functioning properly. So to answer the question, it's all going to be done virtually, remotely by, in fact, India has so many very smart young people. They probably get contracts to take care of this kind of a thing. So it's one in which the local community doesn't really have much of a role, except to be a key stakeholder. And the fact that their performance is being continuously monitored in a totally objective way, which means that there's no scope here for free riding. They cannot, promise to do one thing and not do it. Similarly, if they promise to do wetting and drying and the next year they flood the field, the satellites will immediately point it out and they lose their, the contract. And that's why the importance of the social group becomes so vital. They have to be accountable, and there must be a mechanism by which they'll make sure that the money flows in because it's in everyone's benefit.
Thank you, Vijay. I think it's pretty late for you, but I have 3 more questions and we'll stop after these 3 questions. We don't want to let you go, even though we are possibly troubling you. It's very late in the night.
No problem.
Yeah. So there's a question by my co-board member, Aparna Sahai. She says agricultural practices and climate hazards impact women farmers differently. Are there any possible solutions, and are there any insights that you have on the gender angle of farming.
Absolutely. I think, as we all know, in the cohesion of these kinds of groups, very often is the women are behind it, because they generally have a much better common sense on where they see the benefits than the men. So there would clearly be some huge benefits for the women. But the point is that will again depend on, and I think the key thing is that from pilot to pilot, we have to engage everyone, the men and women who are involved as stakeholders, to begin to appreciate what is in it for them, why this is something which is of great value in the future, where they don't have to depend on just the public sector to repair their next culvert or the bridge or whatever, because this fund can be a community development fund, which can be used for a variety of activities, including skills development for the girls who have been, unfortunately, the women's participation rates have been going down. So that could even be a target of that, saying that it would be very attractive to the global community if that were included as another target, saying that the money will be used to make sure that the girls in the village have as good an opportunity to earn money outside than the boys do. So yes, politically, it would be very important. Gender is the talk of the town now.
Thank you. There's one more interesting question. Are there any examples of farmer collectives coming together and already doing carbon trading and this sort of an activity? Do we have any case studies across the world where there has been a collective action?
Well, the only, I don't claim to have all the knowledge because this is a new area, but huge amounts going on. But from what I saw, the one which was most interesting, and this is available on the website, is to look at the study in the Philippines, which was done because the Philippines have made as a commitment in their NDC, nationally determined contributions, that they are going to do change the practice of paddy cultivation and go to alternate wetting and drying. So because of that, the International Rice Research Institute launched a fairly big study to see the practicality of that. And that is when this idea about the community suddenly came up, because until now, it's been basically an agricultural story from the more developed countries, where each farm is so big that one farmer is enough to make a deal, for climate. Now, the idea that you've got to get several small farmers together, and also the fact that what they found in the Philippines was that in areas where there is a flooding of paddy fields, the farmers who resisted it were able to convince others it's a bad idea. And they had some good reasons. The reason they gave was that, now, like in all of Asia, it's very difficult to get, earlier the back-breaking job of de-weeding and all was for the women. Now, girls are not even willing to go for transplanting rice. So they were saying that, this is all okay in theory, but in practice, if you do alternate wetting and drying, who's going to take care of the weeds? We'll have to pay someone to do it, and that's expensive. Similarly, so there are these kind of little vignettes which have come. But as far as I know, no, there hasn't been. This is really the start of this whole thing. China is going to start it soon. They are already in a stage where they have done a full review of the methane potentials in agriculture. They're also looking at the abatement costs of different activities related to methane. And these will also come into public knowledge. So the advantage is that if one country does a study with similar kinds of profiles with small farmers and so on, others can also benefit. And once you get the kind of data, hopefully we'll be in a better position.
Possibly that's a takeaway for us. I think, Malika, your task is cut out for CMF, and I think in consultation and blessings of Vijay, we should start doing this, at least as an initiative from CMF. We should just start trying it out. I think if nobody's done it, this is a good way for us to be a pioneer. One last question, Vijay, this is from Janki. Janki says, do you think the focus on carbon tax is a part of the resistance of the first world to question their lifestyle and consumption pattern? Do you think it will further entrench the first world, third world divide?
Well, as any economist would tell you, at the end of the day, if you want to tackle this carbon being, it's really nobody's baby, right? Because when carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, until now, we didn't care. But now it has become a huge problem for all of us. But if you want to tackle carbon using economic instruments, you have to bring in some kind of a price. Now, the price what is happening is that countries which are being much more rigorous in applying the pricing concept for carbon, they are having much higher prices, like the European price is very much higher than in other countries. But the point which I think we have to be very careful about is that, yes, there's a political economy argument here. They will raise the price of carbon. They will start then, going into low carbon solutions. But as probably many of you know, the European Union is now going to do something. They've already started talking about something called a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which means that any import coming into Europe, anything, whether it's rice or wheat or anything coming into Europe, will be evaluated by the carbon content. So if your rice produced in India has very high methane generation, it becomes automatically a commodity. I'm just talking of this in the future. It could become an issue if they're trying to export, let's say, basmati rice to Europe. You may find that the carbon content is high, and that creates a problem because it becomes less competitive. Then someone else growing it in, let's say, Texas and calling it Texmati may get the business. So what I'm trying to say is that whether we like it or not, the world is not an equal place. The ones who have the power are able to do things faster than the others. But in any case, at the end of the day, there has to be a price on carbon, because if you don't price carbon, we'll probably all be, the climate change will be impossible to tackle. You can't make physical targets. Ultimately, you have to start making those who are emitting a lot of carbon pay for it. So like even China, all the public sector units now have to pay $8 a ton for the carbon they're generating. It's, it's not a huge amount compared to Europe, but still it is a significant amount of money, which any coal producing power plant has to pay for every ton they generate. So my point is that pricing is essential. And if you went in for, basically there are just two choices. You can have a tax, which will obviously be resisted. Nobody wants to pay a tax. But the emission trading system seems to be more of a backdoor kind of thing, because you're just giving them a certain, you're telling every industry, this is the amount of carbon you can generate. If you generate more than that amount of carbon, you've got to either buy from someone else, or you've got to reduce your carbon footprint. So that generates a price. So when in China, they say it's $8 a ton, that means the allocation given to every power plant is not enough to handle all the carbon dioxide they're generating. So they are going out and paying $8 a ton to others instead of reducing the carbon right away themselves. Yes, I don't know if I answered the question, but I think the dialogue and discussion now has gone beyond the politics of it. As you know, even the Indian position has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And I think what policymakers in India also recognizing is that climate change could be a great opportunity. I mean, we've got such fantastic resources for renewable energy. Why not use it? Similarly, methane is our resource. Why not get money out of it rather than be beaten on the head that we're not doing enough?
Thanks a lot, Vijay. I mean, day before yesterday, when we were talking, you were expressing some concern on whether you would be able to connect these two, and you're wonderfully connected. I think looking at the number of questions and looking at the resonance that your talk has generated, it has been one of the most interesting talks. Thank you very much for taking time off and giving us such a deep and insightful talk. And keep safe. I'll hand it over to Malika for her to do the conclusion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Vijay Jagannathan, and thank you, Professor Shriram, for the excellent question and answer session. Yes, a lot of interest was received when we actually, disseminated the invite for the talk. Largely from the development sector, because climate change is a reality which we are seeing not only in the world, but especially whosoever like us and along with our partner organizations, donors and all, have been working largely with smallholder farmers and in rain-fed areas. And these long dry spells of monsoon, flash floods have affected a number of farmers. A lot of new technologies, especially solar, are being tried in the ecosystem of the partners. We are working with solar energy and even trying biogas, etc. So that is something which are being happening in bits and pieces. Carbon financing is something which we've been hearing on for a long time, but I think no suitable mechanisms are still yet in place for these. And a lot of farmer producer organizations are also being promoted in India. The government also has a special focus. So this could be an additional stream for them. So with the request to all partners, we together as a sector also can negotiate and work for such pilots, so that small farmers can actually get the added advantage of adoption of the energy saving or the eco-friendly practices, much of which, like many others have shared, are already being practiced in India. So why don't we also basically recognize that effort in form of an incentive? So thank you very much, Dr. Vijay Jagannathan, Rajiv Vyas, Professor Shriram, and we had over around 120 participants, and a lot of our board members and founding members were also with us, including Dr. Ashok Agarwal, Mr. Arun Pandey, Mrs. Aparna Sahai, Mr. Devilal Vyas, Mr. Rajesh Singhi, Mr. Ganesh Neelam, and others. So a lot of gratitude from their side also to you for delivering this talk. And thank you to the participants for finding time on a Sunday morning to listen to this talk. And since it is, we hold it on the birth anniversary, so I think it was great that we could get your time also, sir, such a late time at your level. Yeah, thank you so much. And with this, we can end the webinar. Thank you.